Good morning everyone and welcome to the Smithfield Library. My name is Rachel Bailey and I'm the librarian here. And welcome, and I'm glad you've been able to join us for our Meet the Author event today, where we will be talking with Chrystopher Spicer, who's our author. Before we start today, I would like to acknowledge the people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we're standing today. I would also like to pay respects to their elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to the other Indigenous peoples who are present today. I'm pleased to introduce you to our local author, Chrystopher Spicer, and today he's going to be talking about his new title, which is called Cyclone Country, the language of place and disaster in Australian literature, which was released in 2020. We do have some copies of the books over here as well. I'll tell you a little bit about Chrystopher. He is a senior tutor in academic writing and research and an adjunct senior research fellow at James Cook University. He has a Doctorate of Philosophy in Australian Literary Studies and Culture. He has attained a Master of Arts in American Literature and Creative Writing, and he has also published on a wide variety of historical and bibliographical topics, including Duchess, The Story of the Windsor Hotel, published in 1993, Clark Gable, Biography, Filmography, Bibliography, which was published in 2002, Fall Girl, My Life as a Western Stunt Double in 2010, Clark Gable in Pictures, Candid Images of the Actor's Life, which was published in 2011, Great Australian World Firsts, The Things We Made, The Things We Did, 2012, and The Flying Adventures of Jessie Keith Chubby Miller, the Southern Hemisphere's first international aviatrix. Now, Chrystopher is originally from the beautiful Apple Island, and he must have seen the light and he's moved to North Queensland. He's passionate about reading and books and the preservation of memory. He's owned by a 100-kilo Mastiff named Sonda, and he has numerous anecdotes from adventures rubbing shoulders with members of the literary glitterati, including Linda Duplant and Terry Pratchett, one of my favourites, as well as screen stars including Anthony Hopkins and surviving cast members from the movie Gone with the Wind, and an actor cast as a munchkin in the original Wizard of Oz. Please make Chrystopher Spicer welcome. Thank you.
I won't have to introduce myself now. I was going to do that. Thank you very much for your warm welcome. I appreciate it. Yes, although this book came out last year, we, of course, because of the pandemic, we weren't able to do any face-to-face talking about it with people. We had to do it all virtually. So although I've been using Zoom a lot to talk to people about it, it's really nice to have an actual group of people in front of me to talk to about this. One thing I should say about the title, the way I use the word country is not only in the sense of, yes, this is our Australian country, but also in the Indigenous sense of country, in that we have a spiritual affiliation with the place in which we are, and we have a recognition of this place as being part of us. And this book is all about that relationship as expressed in literature, in books, and how we talk about that relationship, how we review that relationship amongst us. And I think we've already expressed the acknowledgement of country, so thank you. Now, and these were just some of the books. I didn't know whether we'd be able to have them here today, but we can, and these are just some of the books that I've worked on, and I'll just talk about them really briefly. This is the Windsor Hotel in Melbourne, and really this is a biography of a hotel, which is very interesting to do because it's all about people anyway. If you didn't have people, you wouldn't have the hotel. That's what it's all about. It's there for the people. So it was really interesting being able to do this project. We did this a number of years ago to celebrate the anniversary of the hotel, and its restoration and opening to the public many years ago. And so it was a really great project to be able to work on that. I was not only just able to talk to people, but I was able to talk to a lot of the previous staff that worked in the hotel, and many of them had really long associations with the hotel that went back a really long way, all the way back to when they were chopping firewood for boilers, and you had to get out there and clean the silverware by hand and all that sort of thing. So it was a great chance to look at it. The Clark Gable one came along after this one, actually. I was talking to another author who had just written a biography of Marilyn Monroe. And he said, look, I was working on this biography about Marilyn Monroe. The last movie that she completed was a movie called The Misfits, in which she starred with Clark Gable, and that was his last movie as well. And he said, I was able to find virtually nothing in print about Clark Gable. He said there were a couple of anecdotal biographies written not long after he died. He said, but after that, nothing. There's nothing currently in print, and there's certainly no researched book about him. He said, you should do one. And I said, yeah, right. Yeah, I'm going to set off to do a Hollywood biography, right? But that's what happened, and not only one, but two, because we had enough material left over from the first one in terms of photographs. The first one I really had to concentrate on the text more than the photographs, and the publisher came along to me later and said, well, look, you really should make use of all those photographs that you've got there, some of which hadn't been seen a lot before, and we'll put them in another book. So we did that, so the two really go together. As a result of that one of the photographs that I used, and this is often an example of how books come along, by the way, is they quite often work in a chain. You start off with one, and then someone else sees that one and says, oh, I could tell you a story about that, and there's your next book, you know. So, and so in this case, I happened to come across a photograph of this lady talking to Clark Gable at a racecourse. And I tracked down who the lady was, and it was this lady, Martha Crawford Cantarini. And at that time, she'd become a racehorse trainer, but before that, she'd been a racehorse trainer in the sense of training them to work in movies. And she had, in fact, back in the 50s, been one of the very, very few stunt women who were working for Hollywood. She was the one who fell out of buggies and fell off horses and fell out of trees, you know. all that stuff the stars didn't want to do, people like Martha did. And we were able to use this great photograph on the front here. She's actually coming off this horse. The horse is doing a fall, the horse is going over as they're trained to do, and she's actually leaving the saddle so that she can hit the ground on her feet and not be crushed by the horse when it goes over. And it's a great photograph. And that was a fascinating project. But by then I thought I really should start moving sideways out of movies a bit and get into something else. And we'd been sitting around, a group of friends and I, in Melbourne, used to sit around and have coffee, and we always used to say, you know, there's got to be a book that in the clever things that Australians have done, which they have done. They've done a lot of very clever stuff. And we thought, well, there's been books done about Australians who've invented things in Australia, but there's a group of Australians who were the first to do things in the world, ever. And I thought, surely someone must have written that book by now, but no, they hadn't. And this is the thing that publishers always love to hear. You mean no one's written this? Yes, I'm going to be the first one. I'm like, woohoo. So we went away and did that one. There's 29 stories about people and one about a ship, which was the Empress of Australia, which was actually the first ship of its kind to be built in the world. The other 29 people were the first people to achieve various things. So we had explorers, people who sailed around the world, people who invented things, all kinds of fascinating stuff in there. So there's quite a range of achievements. It's not just all about invention. It's really about human achievement and celebrating Australian achievement, that we are indeed really significant as achievers, and we've got this whole batch of firsts up there that are the first in the world. And lo and behold, as a result of that one, I came across Jessie Miller's story. No one had heard about Jessie Miller much, but she was actually the first woman to travel in an aircraft from England to Australia. And she did it as a co-pilot, which is why she didn't, in her day, she got a lot of cred for it, but now the cred tends to go to the first woman who flew solo all the way, but not the first woman who actually did it in a plane. And Jessie Miller did it, as well as a whole lot of other things. She was, in fact, the first person to pilot an aircraft across Bass Strait. First woman, sorry, to pilot an aircraft across Bass Strait and into Tasmania. She was the first woman, at one time she held the speed record across the United States both ways. East-west, west-west. She held a number of records in the States. She was the first woman to fly from the east coast of America to Cuba, for example. So she was a really interesting person, and her life was quite fascinating. She got tangled up in a fascinating murder mystery. That was another whole chapter in her life again. So on to ours. Cyclone Country came about because when I came up here to live, this was really the first time that I'd lived in a cyclone zone. I'd lived with tornadoes, I'd lived with hurricanes, I'd lived with typhoons. This was the first time I'd lived with actual cyclones on land. And so I was quite fascinated with the way people approached it, with the way people dealt with it. Fascinated by the way people integrated it into their lives, in fact, and just, laid back and said, it's going to be right, we'll just hold a party. And, just another wind, it doesn't matter. And so that was, one of the things I was greatly intrigued about. And also that we incorporated it into our life as a season. Other people have 4 seasons, we have another one. This is the cyclone season, so I was intrigued by that as well. So I decided to go look at how we talked about it, how we lived with it, and because I'm fascinated with books, how we approach that in terms of our books, the things that we write, the things that we read. And this is all about the relationship between our place, our weather, our stories, and us. The book is about our search for the words through which we can find meaning amid the chaos, amid the trauma and the devastation that's wrought by extreme weather events. And these weather events come along and entirely disrupt our organised lives. They can entirely disrupt what we thought was a nice relationship that we had with Mother Nature out there. We thought we had this really comfortable relationship with our world, and the cyclone comes along and destroys the whole concept. So how do we deal with that? So these words and stories are important. They form a cultural language by which we maintain the relationships in these dire circumstances with our place and our community, and how they help us cope. So I was surprised to find when I started work on this that this would be the first study of its kind in Australia. No one else had looked at that particular relationship between our extreme weather in the form of cyclones and us. And so I look at the function of the words, the story and the literature in rebuilding our cultural relationships after nature catastrophes, using as an example the literature of the Australian state in Queensland. Now I do bring in other things. I bring in broader context than just here, but I use Queensland as the primary example of how we deal with that relationship. Here's Queensland, as we well know. Beautiful one day, cyclonic the next. And if we want to live here, we've got to cope with that. So, why do it? Why write the book about Queensland cyclones in books? As I said, no one else had done it, much to my surprise. And by this time I had a personal association with it. I'm a cyclone survivor, many of you are. So we're aware that cyclones can be traumatic, significant, life-changing events. And we have the Literary Association. We attempt to cope with what's happened to us. We attempt to cope with these disrupting events in a number of ways, and one of these ways is by telling and writing stories about them. I was interested to find out that, for example, down in Innisfail, after they'd come out the other side of Cyclone Larry, what did they do? They all sit down and produced a local book about it. The school kids wrote poetry, the mothers got together and talked about having the roofs blown off their houses. You know, there are all these personal accounts in this book, and that's what they did. And people from Cardwell came into it, and people from all that local area talked about it. And what happened after Cyclone Yasi? The same thing. Local communities sat down and wrote books together about it, you know. And that's their way of dealing with it. That's their way of coping with it as a community and talking about this hugely disruptive events that's happened to them. They sit down and write about it, and it's their focal point. And we also have an international association, because I was interested to find out as I went in through this project that Queensland is where the naming of cyclonic storms all started. Before that, we just used to name it about when it happened, you know, was St. Swithin's Day hurricane, you know, or it was the hurricane of 1566, you know, we named it after the date or the saint's day, but we didn't have a system. And so it was in Queensland that system started, and I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. Let's talk about our local association for a minute. We probably don't realise it stacks up quite like this. As we know, the tropical cyclones are endemic to our North Queensland coast because we're part of the global tropical region. You know, we get them whether we like them or not. They come along because we're here. Since 1858, over 200 cyclones have impacted Queensland, 53 of which actually came within a 100-kilometre radius of Cairns. That starts to stack up after a while. We don't fortunately suffer from very many that have actually hit Cairns head on, but we've had 53 of them come within a 100k radius, which is near enough. Most major towns and cities along the North Queensland coast have been impacted one way or other by cyclones. Some of them have been severely damaged, some of them not so much, and some of them more than once. Cardwell, for example, has just kept, and Innisfail keep getting hit again and again. And it gets a bit risky living down there, I think. And a cyclone was, in fact, the worst Australian nature disaster in terms of loss of life. Back in 1899, we had a cyclone by the name of Mahina, which struck Princess Charlotte Bay, up there in Cape York, and unfortunately most of the Torres Strait pearling fleet was sheltering there at the time, and got wiped out. And somewhere in the region of about 350 to 400 people probably died in that. Unfortunately, because most of the people involved were either of mixed race or Indigenous people or Torres Strait Islanders, they didn't keep a very detailed record of actually how many people died. Besides which, the cyclone was so severe. It was equivalent to a Cat 5 cyclone. And it was so severe, it was hard to find all the survivors from it, or all the people all the casualties from it. So it's an estimate. So tropical cyclones then are an integral aspect of the history, the culture and the literature of North Queensland. So in the light of our current interest in our relationships with climate, weather and place, and this is a relationship that we're becoming more and more interested in every day, we're becoming having a greater awareness of our relationship with the climate and of climate change and how that's going to affect us. So I thought these three questions were really the basis on which I went ahead with the book. What can literary cyclones tell us about our relationships with our culture, our place, our weather and our people? What does the storied storm tell us about personal experience and resilience in the face of trauma? And what can the literary weather catastrophe reveal about and to us as individuals and as a community? Now, I thought we'd start back with the hurricane for a minute because this is really where our knowledge of cyclonic storms started. Way back with the Tano, the indigenous people of the Caribbean, who had a legend about Atabay, who first created the earth, the sky and celestial bodies. She had 2 sons. When Ukiju, one of the sons, created the sun, the moon, the plants and the animals, the other son, Huracan, became jealous and tore it all up with a powerful wind, becoming the god of destruction. And that name has stayed with us as the hurricane. And you'll notice that's the original Tano symbol and little sculptural pieces they used to do for a hurricane. So way back, before they ever had any contact with Europeans at all, this indigenous people had a concept of a cyclonic storm. You can see clearly one arm's going one way, one arm's going the other, and you've got the eye in the middle. And they had that concept way before we did. And this has come through to us in a modern symbol like this. You can still see that same symbol coming through. Now, we didn't catch up with them until the mid-19th century, when we started to become aware that cyclonic storms were unlike other storms that approached us on a weather front and hit us head on. Cyclonic storms travelled on a path, spinning as they went, and they travelled a pathway. And on either side of the equator, they spun in different directions. The word cyclone came to us in 1848 through an Englishman, Henry Storms Piddington, who was president of the Calcutta Marine Courts of Inquiry, which is significant because, in other words, he was exposed to Indian Ocean storms. So he's exposed to the storms through the cyclonic storms through the Indian Ocean. He took the word from the Greek kuklos for circle, as in the encircling coil of the snake. That's how we got the word cyclone. So he borrowed that idea from the coiling of the snake. And he published the name in his Sailor's Horn Book for the Law of Storms, which was like the Bible for captains at sea. And that's a copy of the book. And in that book, he had these interesting little transparent sheets, which in those days were very thin sheets of horn. And so they were waterproof and they were transparent. You could see through them with the cyclone pattern on it. And what they would do, they would overlay that on a navigation chart, and they would be able to see how to sail out of the storm. not to go into it, but to sail out around the edge of it, in other words, using this. And the directions that he had in the book, as long as you remembered which side of the equator you found were on. So he came up with the idea of cyclone, in fact, as being rather a more generic term. We've got more specific with our use of cyclone. But his idea was that cyclone was going to be the name for all rotating storms, and that something like a hurricane or a typhoon would be a subset of a cyclone. Now, naming storms. This is the man responsible, Mr. Rag, Clement Rag, known by the nickname Red Rag in his day because of his red hair. He was the director of the Chief Weather Bureau in Brisbane from 1887 to 1903. A very literary man, very fluent, very dramatic writing style. If you get a chance to go into Trove and look up any of his forecasts, they used to be marvellous pieces of prose. They weren't just a weather forecast. They're an entire literary dramatic production about the weather, and quite amazing. And he became the first Australian national published weather forecaster because the papers loved this and they picked up his forecasts every day, and it would work its way around Australia in the days before we had an actual national weather forecaster. As he went along, he started to establish a chain of weather stations, and in the finish he had one all the way from Mount Wellington in Tasmania, all the way up to Thursday Island and all the way up to New Caledonia. And they all reported back to the Weather Bureau, and so he started to build up this incredibly, for those days, accurate picture of what the weather was like coming towards us, and no one had that before. And so he had all this information at his disposal, and so it quickly became apparent that just calling these weather formations, you know, the west cyclone or the north cyclone or something like that wasn't going to work. He had to have a system. And so the first system he came up with was the Greek alphabet, being an educated man that he was. And so Cyclone Beta was actually our first recorded named storm according to a system in 1894. And that's the first time anyone had tried that. And to quickly extend the story, otherwise there's a whole other talk just on naming storms, and I won't do that. When he left in 1903, when he left the Weather Bureau, that system went with him, and they didn't keep using it. Fortunately, a senior weather person in England was intrigued by this and wrote it into a book he was writing about weather forecasting. Right up 1940 or so, a chap by the name of George Rippey Stewart was researching the novel that he wanted to write about a storm, and he came across this reference in this English book to this weird Australian who's come up with a system of naming storms. And he said, oh, that'll work for my book, because he really wanted the storm to be a central character in his book. And he thought, oh, the best way to do that is to have a name for the storm. And even better, the really way to get attention would be to give it a woman's name. And he came up with the name Mariah. And yes, a few years later, Lerner and Lowe read his book, wrote the musical Paint Your Wagon, and in that is They Call the Wind Mariah. So you can trace that all the way back to an Australian, okay, who came up with the idea of naming storms. And after that, away we went. Now, of course, in the mid-1970s, women rose up and said, wait a minute, how come we're the fall guys for storms always being named after women, okay? How come it all gets named after us all the time? A women's lib lady in the States suggested instead of hurricanes we should have himicanes. But Australia, once again, being the innovators that we were, took this discussion right on board and said, you know, she's got a point. And so not only did we become the first country in the world to start naming storms, we became the first country in the world to degenderise storms. And I think it was around 1975, we came up with equal gender naming storms, a list, alternate naming male and female storms on our list, and the Americans didn't come along until a couple of years after that. So we're innovators. He goes right back to that book I wrote previously about Great Australian World Firsts. That's one right there. We came up with that innovation. Now, those of you who are interested in wine, know a bit about wine, okay? Good wine and cheese has what we call terroir. In other words, a really good wine connoisseur can have a taste of that red and say, oh, that comes from this particular area of France, and if they're really on board, they'll say it comes from that particular hillside on that particular road, you know, and they can nail it right down to where that wine came from, in the sense of we can taste where the grapes grew, because the quality of the soil and the quality of the climate and the quality of that geography of that area got into the grapes and into the fruit and thus into the wine, okay? So they talk about, and the same for cheese, with the cows. You can tell where those cows came from. Okay? We talk about terroir. And so we can talk about the land where the literature has been created and developed nourishes it and imparts unique qualities to it. So we can think of our literature having terroir in the same sense. We can tell where our literature comes from. So we can tell Queensland literature when we read it, because it's talking about that sense of country, that sense of the relationship we have between us and our country, our land, our area. So the cyclone reveals to people that they are part of the inevitable and uncontrollable cycle of death and birth, destruction and renewal. It reminds us of that, reminds us of our mortality, if you like to think about it that way. And so tropical cyclones are an essential part of the North Queensland terroir. To live in this landscape, one must accept them as part of not just the literal landscape, but also the imaginative, personal, and literary landscapes. Okay? All come into it. So when we talk about landscape, it's not just the view that we're looking at, we're thinking about the imaginative landscape, the personal landscape, and the literary landscape, as all being part of that terroir. We don't often think about maybe that until a couple of decades ago, it was very, very difficult for someone to actually imagine a cyclone. So we're really used to it now. We look at that picture over there and say, oh, there's a cyclone. We have this sense in our mind of this big swirling beast that comes down on us, and this is what the cyclone is. But that's courtesy of satellite photography, and before that high altitude aerial photography, and that's only the last few decades. Before that, people never had that picture of what the cyclone actually looked like. They just saw it coming towards them. Really, the picture that stayed in most people's mind about the cyclone was the red flag. Before long distance forecasting, or before people could notify you in a hurry about things, this is how you knew when a cyclone was coming, when the post office raised the red flag. People used to talk about the post office in Cairns raising the red flag, and they knew that the cyclone was coming down on them. And in Cardwell and in Innisfail and all our coastal towns down there, they had one of these that went up above the post office, and everyone said, we're on warning. We're on warning. Cyclone's about to come down on us. So this was their imagination of a cyclone, really. Not that. It was more like this. So you can think of our pictures changed. The way we think about them in our mind has changed. And so writing about the cyclone also helps us imagine it, the cyclone. Also helps us imagine the impact that it has on people. Now, these are the group of books that I looked at. In writing my book, I looked at a group of books, and these are the main ones I should say I looked at. I looked at a lot. But I thought these ones particularly encapsulated what we were after. Vance Palmer's novel Cyclone is the earliest one. It was written just after the war, after World War II, but he actually started it before World War II. In 1932, he and his wife lived on Green Island, just off Cairns there. Lived there for most of a year, and wrote a whole lot of very interesting, quite fascinating articles about nature and about the natural environment up here and out on the reef. They made a lot of friends. In particular, one of the guys who used to operate one of the boats that travelled from Cairns to Green Island and back, and they went on quite a few excursions with him, became quite friendly with him, and they said, oh, we'll come back 1934, we'll come back in a couple of years' time, and we'll do it all over again. I'll come back with a whole group of people this time. We'll have a big excursion up and down the reef. But unfortunately, 1934 along came a big cyclone and severely damaged Cairns. And unfortunately, a few people lost their lives, including the ship's captain that he knew. And he was really affected by this. And that's why it took him a long time to write the book, because he had to get over his really close personal association with these people in this place that had been hit really badly by the cyclone. And he wrote a couple of articles and gradually developed those articles into the book that he published in 1947. So it's a really good look at, a really good snapshot, if you like, of what, even though he doesn't call it Cairns, it's really what Cairns, it is Cairns, and it's what Cairns was like in those at that particular time. And he really nails down that picture of what local environment and local life was like right about then, and the impact that destructive storms had on people's lives and how they coped with it, how they endured. Thea Astley's book, A Boatload of Home Folk, is about a group of people stranded on an island. Their cyclone bears down on the tropical island, and the ship can't get away, and they're all stuck there while the cyclone rages around them. So it's great, one of those little closed room stories, as we call them, or elevator stories, sometimes as they're known, when you've got a group of people stuck in a very small room and they can't get out. What's going to happen, And so you have that whole claustrophobic feeling. The storm raging out there, they can't get away, they're at each other, and the raging storm is reflected in the people. There's a bit of raging going on amongst the people, and they're at each other. Yeah, so you get that reflection of the what's going on with the group of people, the group dynamic, in the dynamic of the storm as well. Eye of the Storm, Patrick White's Eye of the Storm. Astley and White were actually quite good friends. They had this lapsed Catholic thing going between them, and so you can see quite a lot of Catholic ritual comes out in both in their writing, in the structure of some of what they write. White was interested in the cyclone, being Patrick White, from a more spiritual point of view. His novel is about an elderly woman by the name of Elizabeth Hunter, who, a little earlier than when we're reading about her in the novel, was also stranded on an island off the coast of Queensland by a cyclone, and she had to take shelter. And she came out from a shelter right in the middle of the eye, as the eye was going over. And she has this very spiritual experience of being in this very still place with the cyclone raging around out here somewhere, in this still place in the middle, and lo and behold, along come these 7 swans. It happens to everybody, really. Along come these 7 swans, and she has this experience of feeding the swans from this old bread that's lying around, and forever afterwards, that experience stays with her and gives her that impression that she hasn't lived the best kind of life that she could, that she could improve it, she needs to improve her life, and that eye of the cyclone kind of becomes the spiritual eye watching her for the rest of her life until she dies, and she's aiming to return to that same spiritual experience at a moment of death. And be accepted into the afterlife, if you want to think of it like that. And so it's a very interesting spiritual look at it, which is why I looked at that book. Each of these books looks at the cyclone experience in a slightly different way. Alexis Wright's Carpentaria is just simply the most wonderful book. If you haven't had a chance to read this book, do. It's just the most wonderful book. As much because of the way the story is told as because of what's in it. She set out to write an epic, if you like, have a try at writing a Homeric epic. Ulysses, Troy, something like that, an epic in an Indigenous way, about Indigenous people and their interaction with European people, and both those people's interaction with their land, with their country, and with the weather, with the cyclones. And it's truly the most marvellous book. You really have to read it a couple of times, because we're not used to the way Indigenous people tell a story. They tell it as European folk, we're used to stories being told in straight chronological lines. We have a beginning, an end, and a sequence. And Indigenous people don't have that at all. In fact, their story structure is very much like a cyclone, in that it's like this. And it's layered. It goes up and down. So you can start the story here and go down here and then come back up here, and you're still in the same story. So it has that spiraling quality to it. I always tell people, look, if you want to, as training for reading Carpentaria, watch the movie 10 Canoes, which is David Gulpilil's 10 Canoes, which is about it's an Indigenous story about Indigenous people out hunting. And it has that, they start here, but then the story goes to here, and then the story goes to here, and then back to here. So it has that spiraling quality about it. And that'll get you used to the way that's told. And I think I've read this book probably half a dozen times now, and I see something different in it every time I come back to it. I go, I never saw that before. And it's just the most marvellous thing. And I fortunately have had the chance to talk to Alexis a couple of times, and we've been able to sit down and have a discussion. I was very, very fortunate, in fact, that she was willing to have a read of the chapter that I wrote, because I was really nervous. I must really say the right thing about this, So I was very happy that she was glad to sit down and read it, and she said wonderful things about it. So I was very pleased. But she's a fascinating person to talk to. She's very quiet. She's very quiet to talk to, but fascinating to talk to none the same. And the book is bracketed by 2 cyclones. There's a cyclone at the beginning, cyclone at the end. And the book's all about the relationship with the country and the cyclone. And the cyclone in the end gives the whole country a chance to be recreated and to start all over again. Earth's Breath is not a novel at all, it's a poem cycle. The whole book is one poem, well, it's a series of poems, I should say. In a way, it's one poem because it's all talking about the same experience, and that's Susan Hawthorne's experience going through Cyclone Larry. And the book does it in chronological sequence. It talks about the lead up to the cyclone, going through the cyclone, and how she feels after the cyclone. And briefly, she feels that the cyclone has really entered her as a person, that she's imbued with the spirit of the cyclone. She talks about the cyclone being, in and with me, and she feels then that having gone through the experience of being in the cyclone, she's never out of it. It's always there in her somewhere. And so it's a fascinating poetry cycle to read. And once again, I was very fortunate to actually talk to Susan about it, and able to sit down and have a chat about it. When we were doing it, I really felt that I had to get her permission, really, to be able to use it, because I talk about it a lot in detail, and so I thought I really should get her permission to do that. And she was gracious enough to do that, and so we had a bit of a community project, really, writing about that poetry cycle, which was great. And look, I've really talked about this, so we can probably skim through it, I think. And I've just talked about those books in detail. And Carpentaria. And right, yes. And as I come out with Susan Hawthorne, she realises that her personal experience is part of the global storm experience too. And that's one of the things that my book looks at. While we use Queensland literature as an example, I'm also encouraging people in the book to be aware that our storms are everybody's storms. Everybody has experience with storms. You read some of the books that were written about Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. You see the commonalities. You realise, oh yes, we've really all gone through that same experience. The storm might have been spinning the other way, but we go through that same storm experience and it has that same impact on us. So I'm looking at that global storm experience. So storytelling is a way in which that acceptance of our country takes place, by which place becomes our place, by which we claim cultural connection, and this is the sense of country. We have this sense of country, we have this cultural connection. Our stories are not only about place, they are of place. They don't simply portray place, but are formed by the place itself. It's very interesting, for example, I don't know if you know the author Janet Turner Hospital, but although she began her writing career in Queensland, she went overseas and continued her writing career overseas. And it's interesting looking at the differences and the similarities between the stories she writes about here when she's writing them here and when she's writing them over there. And you get that sense of we still have that feeling of country being within us no matter where we are. David Malouf's stories are much the same too. We have that sense of country being in here. No matter where we are, we're going to write about it, and it's going to sound like country. So our stories of cyclones reveal a culture of endurance, of survival, of resilience and rebuilding. And I like this slogan written on the fence during Cyclone Debbie, which says a lot about our sense of resilience. Bring it on, we can do it. In Cyclone Country then, I'm exploring what the cyclone reveals to us about the impact of weather events on our cultural, personal and spiritual landscapes, as well as our literal one, as I said before. We're looking at all these things. Writers, after all, seek to make sense of place as part of their search for meaning. One could say that they're putting into words their terroir as well as their terror, as they seek meaning in catastrophe. Catastrophe always seems to us so random. So if you look at streets that are hit by cyclones or bushfires for that matter, you have that experience of this house goes and that house stays, These people just lost their garage, these people lost their entire house above the foundations. You've got that randomness about it. And it's also got that randomness about where a cyclone strikes. You know, cyclones have that really interesting habit of wandering. You know, the Weather Bureau may seem to say, well, we've got the track sorted out, it's going to be here, but then it comes down here, and then it does a bit of a U-turn, and then it goes out there, and it comes back. So it wanders around a little. Yeah, we've had cyclones in Queensland that have done the complete U-turn. They've gone south, come back, gone up, gone over to the Gulf, come back again. You know, so we have that sense of randomness in it as well, and so part of our way of trying to sort it out, part of our way of coping with it, is to see if we can make sense of that randomness, to see if we can make sense out of that chaos. And so writing stories and reading the stories that people have written is a way of making sense out of that, and a way of developing that relationship that we have with our country. Our sense of our place in this connected world is enriched by our exploration of our environment. It's also enriched by our willingness to explore and to look outward into those other places as we experience the ebb and flow of interchange between us and the world. Yes, we're impacted by the cyclone, but so are other people. Our storms are other people's storms. Yeah? We have a commonality of experience. We have a storm community, if you want to think about it that way. So while it's our country here, the globe is also our country as well, you know, and we have that commonality of experience. So these relationships between nature and culture, between people and weather, between language and art, between life and natural environment, between us and our country, are expressed in our stories. This is why our stories are so important, and this is why I write about them. Thank you.
Chrystopher, thank you very much for coming to talk to us today. It's been a fantastic and really fascinating experience.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Does anybody want to ask me any questions about this?
Just a comment or two. Earth's breath, you mentioned, people carry with them the storm. I lived at the Northern Beaches here for 18 years, from 1973 onwards, and I connected with a lot of people who were in Tracy, Cyclone Tracy in Darwin in 1974, and they were traumatised. And that didn't leave them. It diminished, but it didn't leave them. And the way of spelling cyclone was P-S-Y-C-L-O-W-N.
Exactly. Indeed, yes. No, and she talks about it the same way. She says, yes, no, the experience doesn't leave you. You know, when you're right in the middle of it like that, and particularly, I think one of the things that sticks with people most is the noise.
Yeah.
The actual sound of it, and you get that in the Cyclone Tracy Museum in Darwin when they play that. They recorded the church sermon and played the noise back to you, and that's really what stays with you. I can remember that from Cyclone Yasi.
It's like a grieving, because it stays with you. It gets less. The cyclone you had up there, Bring It On Bog's Breath Cafe, they put up a big plywood window protection, and somebody spray painted on it, "Kiss My Yasi."
Now, speaking of names, though, what we're talking about Yasi, what might interest you is that the storms get named after the meteorological weather district where the storm originates. Okay, so Debbie got named Debbie because it originated here. Yasi, of course, didn't originate here. Yasi originated in Fiji and was named by the Fijian Weather District. And unlike our system, their system also allows them to use the names of objects. So Yasi actually means sandalwood. So if you think of it being called Cyclone Sandalwood instead of Cyclone Yasi, think about that comparison in your head for the rest of the day, and think about how differently would we have treated the cyclone maybe if we'd been calling it sandalwood instead of Yasi? Because one of the other interesting things about naming is genderisation, of course, and we saw that with Debbie, for example. It is the generalisation, the characterisation of the cyclone, and there's a whole other field out there on this one, about the way, particularly about the way media treats. I was interested that there's a woman in America, a colleague of mine, has just written a book about the way the American media treats hurricanes and reacts to the names of hurricanes and characterises the storms, the good storms and bad storms, along with male and female storms, you know, and I think probably the example we had here was Larry. Because Larry is such a laid-back name, it was interesting that at the time no one took the cyclone really seriously until it landed here. Because everyone just went, oh, Larry, you know. Larry's a bit of a larrikin, you know. And it was interesting reading some of the poetry that was written by the children down in Innisfail, that they drew that into their poetry, that Larry was the larrikin who went around and vandalised things, went around with a club and beat things, you know, invaded their homes and broke their windows, you know, and it was very interesting characterisation of the storm according to the name. So it's interesting, and the media now does that very, very quickly, you know, almost before the storms got started. They start to develop, and so next time we have one, you might want to look at that. As soon as the storm gets started, we start getting that flavour in the media of who the storm is, not what it is, but who it is, as a person. Probably because that's how the media sees they can, people can keep it in their head, keep track of it. We see it as a person, not just as a weather. It's an interesting way of looking at it. Anything else anybody wants to ask? Kristen?
Indigenous stories, it might be a completely different realm, but do they have stories where they referred to cyclones before white people came to Australia?
Now, that's a very interesting question, and I think probably not so much here. There's more up around the Gulf, I think. There's more stories about cyclones up around the Gulf region than down this way, and I think that's simply because the Indigenous people knew it was coming and got out of the way. And by the time the cyclone got here, they were over the other side of the range. So I don't think they hung around to create stories about it. So you certainly don't have that sense as the Carib Indigenous people have. You don't have that sense of them sitting around developing stories about cyclones. But that's here. Up around the Gulf they did. And as Alexis Wright has in her book, she has a character in her book, an Indigenous person who is a magic man and a cyclone creator. He can actually stir up the cyclone. There's a particular spot on the coast where these particular rock formations are, where he can go out there and start stirring up the water with the right stick, and he starts stirring up the storm. Next minute you've got a big storm happening, you know. So you've certainly got those kind of legends up there, yeah.
Can I just say one more? That was really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And, but I was just going to ask you, I know you would have read Ian Townsend's The Devil's Eye.
Yes.
But just for everyone here, that was about the Princess Charlotte Bay cyclone where all those people died?
Yes, it was, in a way.
Yeah. So that was at Townsville. He was in Townsville when he wrote that, I think.
Yeah, I think that was, I'm not a real fan of the book, but sorry, but no, you're right, and that exactly. The Devil's Eye, I think it was The Devil's Eye. Yeah, I think it's The Devil's Eye. I think it was. Yes, and that is the storm he was writing about. Yeah, but he changed a lot about it. So it's really faction. You've got to be aware when you're reading it that it's faction, because he's actually changed a lot for the purpose of writing, for the purpose of his story. But he did clearly research a lot of the details about it, and it gets a lot of the atmosphere of the storm pretty right.
It is fiction though, isn't it? It's fiction.
Yeah, but he's mixed the two. He's done the factual research. So it's what I like to call faction, in that, it's based on fact, but it's fiction, He has people living that clearly died, It's a bit, I think he should have probably delineated it a bit more.
That's interesting.
Anyway, that's just my preference. Thanks for bringing that up, though. That is, it's an interesting book to read. Yeah.
And in your book, I guess you cover like Townsville, south of Townsville, right up, just from the top. It's not just Cairns.
No, I'm looking at the whole coastline all the way up, and up into the Gulf region, because I'm addressing where she is. I was, in terms of here, I was keeping it within Queensland, so I'm talking about tropical cyclones really. But as I was saying before, I do look at some of the literature about tropical storms in other parts of the world, as well as that. So there's quite a lot of it, and I'm just trying to do a representative piece.
Australia, we decided to do the male-female thing, or was that a universal?
We were the first country to do it. The Americans came along a couple of years later, but the idea had started over there, but for some reason we got going with it quicker, and somebody seized on it as being a great idea here a bit quicker, and we got the legislation through and started to do it a couple of years before they got there, I think. And I think that was probably simply bureaucracy. The bureaucracy was simpler here than there, I think, in terms of the people in charge. Thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate you coming along. Thank you.